first of all, I think what brings us together is the place. It's perhaps not so much the theoretical model, which somewhat loosely underlines resilience, collapse, and reorganization. It is the place. And that has very much to do with development at the margins. Let's say, in this phase of intense globalization, we find ourselves in a situation that former peripheral economies are getting more and more central in the global setting. Naivasha, the case we are dealing with here, provides about 50 to 60% of cut flowers to the Northwest European markets. So the flowers we usually see in the mornings in our flower shops, we present to our mothers, dears. Right? Some days, frequently they do come from Naivasha, and that brings about pertinent changes of the social ecological systems in Naivasha, pertaining to ecological services. Flower farms do need quite a bit of water. They need quite a bit of workers. So this concentration of flower farming in that area leads to massive migration into the area. So these are points which do interest us together, and there are old shots and experienced people who have worked for 30 years probably.
30 years, yes.
30 years in Naivasha. And there are younger projects like ours, which is just working for 1.5 years in the area. And of course, let's say, at this stage, scientists or in these fields rarely really compete for resources. It's not like the frantic research for all early Homo sapiens. So we profit a great deal from this prior experience of other scholars, and this is probably why this meeting was convened in the way it was convened.
I'm only an ecologist, and I started as an ecologist trying to understand the straightforward limnology of the lake, what made it function. And then I realized after about 3 or 4 years of that the reason that the lake was functioning unpredictably was because it was full of alien species. So I kept going back to understand the dynamics of the alien species. And as I thought I understood it, then a new alien species would arrive and the whole thing would start again. So the reason that I've been going there for 30 years is not because I could predict what was happening, but rather the opposite. I felt I finished and I understood the system, and then something else upset it. And you could almost say that the new dynamics of the globalization of the flower industry is yet another influence which is changing the ecology in a way that is continuing to interest me. So I'm very, very enthusiastic about the collaboration, because I still, despite all the additional research groups involved in the lake, there isn't a research group that is basically continuing to understand the ecology. So I still have a role, even though there's much bigger dynamic and much more research. Mm-hmm. And it's still very interesting because it's still changing. And I could say that I've spent 30 years documenting its decline, and yet I could now see ways in which it can be restored, at least partially. And that restoration of the ecology will then benefit all the people, because now we think of ecology not as a pure science, but as an ecosystem service to people. And we think of the health of the ecosystem as the health of the people that are involved in it, as we've heard from the two presentations from the German group and the Canadian group. Mm-hmm. And the Dutch group are somewhere in between the two. So I find this very, very exciting.
Social science research wasn't done much in Russia so far. So that's why in the research group also these social science sub-projects were included in order to fill a gap basically there. And I think looking at stuff at Lake Naivasha from a social science perspective is very important, because it brings in the the issues of actors having different kinds of powers and negotiating different issues like the riparian-related issues I talked about in the morning, and how different actors actually be able to capture some resources and exclude others out it's more relevant today even than at that time when there were not so many people in. So I think we are a newcomer in Naivasha research, but I hope that we will find our place and contribute and benefit from the experience from the former research, but also contribute something for your research as well.
What is the common theoretical interest? And I think you pointed out that quite nicely. Every time you came back, there was a surprise. Basically, the non-linearity and the non-predictability of systems. This is perhaps what interests us as social scientists and what interests ecologists at the moment. This also contains, to my point of view, a political message that such systems are not easy to govern. There's no clear-cut process where you could easily predict, if we do this today, this will be the outcome tomorrow. So these systems need much more leeway, much more perhaps flexibility in management, and probably this is what we are trying to explore from different angles.
And you might also see that the management on one day could be the responsible of a certain government ministry, and on the next day it's a different ministry. Because the ecology has just changed, the ecological issues have risen and fallen. Like on one day it might be fisheries, on another day it might be land. And they're big issues that still have to be solved that are not ecological issues. Well, the solution is not ecological but political and social.
Basically, we do not, as scientists, probably give easy-made or blueprints for management for tomorrow. I think it's our task to describe complexity, the interconnectedness of systems, and this is probably something what we are discovering. What happens if the reeds are taken off? There is not an easy equation that you take off the reeds and that has a certain effect on the riparian system. It has much broader effects or ripple down effects of what Patrick showed in history, what happened, basically processes happening in the 1920s, 1930s, which still unfold their certain ecological functions are being felt in the system. So to understand complexity across spatial scales, but also across temporal scales, so within history and across space, this is probably the best an interdisciplinary team can do. Well, scientists frequently find it difficult to give clear-cut descriptions to what politicians should then decide. I think what is then needed is probably, let's say, an add-on where, let's say, these options, political options, then rather come up from a dialogue between politicians who tell us what is feasible and scientists which may perhaps focus on what is necessary.
And politicians always want something that is a single word answer or something very, very simple.
Very short.
And so scientists are not used to giving something very simple, and that's the importance of the dialogue. And the dialogue, in a sense, has two stages, and this is just the first stage where the different scientists are talking to each other. And then they're better able to give a unified opinion to the politicians or the decision formers, but still it has to be simplified. There are two things I could say to, say, the younger people I've listened to today. The first is that what they're doing, what they have found out, is a small part. It's a single piece of a jigsaw that may have 200 pieces. And it's very easy, and I can remember the time when I did the same thing, to think you've solved the whole problem with this one jigsaw piece. And the second thing, which is much harder to do, is if that problem interests you, to try to keep at it and get the other pieces of the jigsaw together. And I think I've been very, very fortunate to be able to do that in Naivasha, to be able to go back, because I kept thinking, well, I first might have thought several times I've found the answer to the ecological problem, and then considered that I realised I hadn't found the answer. But in the position I was, the job I have in the university, I was always able to go back. So that's something which may not be possible, but is very, very valuable to be able to go back and continue to add pieces to the jigsaw.